Okay, so let's get going on today's class. So what we're going to do today is we're going to wrap up our look at critical thinking, or at least the critical thinking checklist. We're going to keep doing critical thinking throughout the entire semester, but we'll wrap up our look at the checklist. Just want to make you aware of that. Then we're going to go through the checklist for the critical reader, which is also great for the critical writer. So when you're starting to read the articles that you get from your library assignment, be sure to practice this checklist. Be sure to practice. Right. So now we're switching gears away from the library assignment to what you're going to do afterwards. So once you find your articles, these are the articles that are going to form the background research of your research paper. So we need to write about something. We need to write about false memories. We need to write about group cognition. This is where you're going to find that information in these articles. So it's going to require you to read these articles, and we want to start developing those skills so we can read it as a critical thinker, as a critical reader. Because as we saw last time, you can't take the source of the information anymore as a guarantee that it's good information. So we saw this last time. Nicholas Gueguen, you'll never find out unless you meet him at a conference. Like, nobody knows how to pronounce half of the scientists' names. Anyways, this women's hairstyle and men's behavior field experiment was published in a peer-reviewed, respected journal. However, when people, and not a lot of people, not everybody knows this, but when people read this and they critically thought about the information, they engaged with the information, as we saw last time, two readers noticed that there was very suspicious data. So when the averages were reported, and that's what these numbers here are, when the averages were reported for 90 pedestrians, male pedestrians, and 90 female pedestrians, what they found was that it just was very coincidental that every single average ended in 0. Right? That might happen for one of the averages, but to add up 90 numbers and get an average of the average that ends in point something 0, and for it to happen 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different in 6 different situations in a row, that only happens 1 in 714 times. So the implication is that this could have happened by chance, but there's a 713 and 714 chance that this is fabricated data. So again, you can't take the fact that it's published in a scientific journal as a guarantee that the data is credible. We have to engage with it and think about, what does it mean? What does this data actually say? So that's kind of an open-ended statement. You want to engage with it. You want to be critical when you think about it. So how do we do that? That's where the checklist comes in. So these are very helpful questions for when you're reading, very helpful questions for when you're writing. This is basically a checklist that you want to go through at the end of every section. And to try to answer these questions for every section is going to help you engage and understand the material. So when you're reading, try to use this checklist. When you're writing, also use this checklist. We're going to give you more details in terms of what the outline is. But your writing should be clear enough, and it should have enough information that if you gave your writing to somebody who had never read this before, they should be able to answer all the questions on this checklist. And again, it helps engage your critical thinking processes. So let's take a look at what this checklist is. We'll start off with the first section, which is the introduction. As you read the introduction, and definitely by the end of the introduction, you should be able to answer the following 3 questions. So they all include, or they all can be answered with information from the introduction. First question, what is the author's goal? So by the end of the introduction, you should be able to answer, what is this author trying to do? What question are they trying to answer? What piece of psychological information are they trying to discover? What theory are they trying to test? What's the purpose of this paper existing? You should be able to answer that. If you cannot by the time you finish the introduction, you missed something. You haven't, there's a piece of information that you didn't process. You have to go back, you have to find out that information. If you're writing this, and at some point you don't specify what your goal is, so if this is you as a writer, and you don't at some point say, we're trying to answer the question of how does false memory affect memory in groups, your introduction is incomplete. So again, it can be used to help you read, it can be used to help you write. So what is the author's goal? What's the purpose of this paper? What are they trying to accomplish? Number two, what hypothesis will be tested in the experiment? So what hypothesis, what if-then statement is going to be tested? Saying, if this theory is true, and we do this to subjects, then this will occur. You should be able to state that. You should be able to say, if the Smith and Smith theory is true, and they ask subjects to fill out the Beck's depression inventory, then we should see these scores should occur. So you might have one hypothesis, you might have two, you might have three. There's depending upon how many theories are being tested, but there's going to be at least one, and you should be able to identify it. You should be able to state it in the if this theory is true, and they do this to the subjects, then this outcome should occur. So you should be able to do that. And then one of the commonalities for each section of this checklist is that the last part of each checklist asks you to guess the next part of what it is that you're about to read. And this is probably the most important part in terms of engaging your critical thinking processes. So in this case, we're reading the introduction. The next step up, the next section up is the method section. The next section is what they did, what design did they use in their experiment. But before you read that, you want to ask yourself, if I had to design an experiment to test this hypothesis, what would I do? And if you don't answer this before reading the method, it's really difficult to unring that bell and figure out what you would have thought before you heard that new information. So it's kind of like when you were kids and you were trying to figure out if somebody was going to be your best friend for life. So you would ask them, what's your favorite band? What's your favorite movie? What's your favorite TV show? But you wouldn't let them answer second. You have to answer at the same time. Because if they're like, well, what's your favorite TV show? And you're like, Stranger Things. And they're like, yeah, me too. That doesn't carry a lot of weight. But if they say it at the same time, then you know you're onto something. Same thing here. If you come up with a method section after you read their method section, 99 times out of 100, you're going to say, that's a pretty good idea what they did. Because it's hard to unring that bell. But if you say to yourself, all right, based on what I read, if I had to design an experiment, what would I do? And you just come up with an idea. You just say, I would take two groups of subjects. I would treat one group like this, one group like this. I would measure them in this way. And then I would compare those two, on this dependent measure. If you just come up with something as simple as that, you then have a memory, a mental model that you have created that you can then compare to what it is that you read later. And that way you can see discrepancies, and they're a lot more readily apparent than if you just have a vague idea and then you read their methods and you're like, well, of course, that's what I would have done too, because what else is there? So in each of these sections, you'll see that last question, guess what's coming up next. Figure out what you would do, and then write it down or be very clear about it in your head, because what you want to do is once you get that down, you go to the next section, and the first question here is, my proposed method better than the author's? You're not going to be able to answer that unless you propose the method. So the first one is, my proposed method better than the author's, requires you to be very clear on what you would have done, what you thought would be a good idea, and then take a look at what they did, and you can see any discrepancies. And that'll engage your critical thinking. Why did they do it that way? Is it actually better? That's that's the first one. Is it actually better than what I thought? Is it worse than what I thought? It lets you make those kinds of comparisons. Number two, Does the author's method actually test a hypothesis? You would be surprised how often this is not the case. So the authors, might say something like, well, we're going to test memory, in groups. And you get to the method section and you're like, you're not testing memory, you're testing confidence. Like you're asking them about confidence. You said you were going to test memory. You'd be surprised how often that actually happens. So ask yourself, the method that they made, if it differs from mine, does it actually test the hypothesis? It might not, in which case, not such a good experiment. But again, that's that idea of that critical thinking process. And then lastly, if I had to design an experiment to test this hypothesis, what would I do? Now that you've come up with your idea, now that you've seen their idea, see if you can improve on it, right? Again, actively engage and see, given everything that you've read, is this the best way to do it? Maybe we shouldn't do it this way. Maybe we should do it in a different way. So one thing that is often overlooked, but you should pay attention to it, are the characteristics of the subjects. Oftentimes, in the experiments that are published in psychology, we get our subjects from the students that are enrolled in our psychology major. And that means that the characteristics of the subjects through time change with the demographics of individuals that take psychology. So if you read studies from the 60s and from the 70s, you will see in the description of the subjects, we had 80 males, we had 20 females. We had 70 males, we had 30 females. We had mostly males and fewer females. You read articles today, published recently, or just take a look around the room, and it's the complete opposite. We had 80 females, 20 males. We had 70 females, 30 males. Maybe that's an issue. Maybe you'll say to yourself, if I had to design an experiment to test this hypothesis, it seems like gender issues might be influencing the results. Maybe I would have 50-50, if I could do it. So again, helps you engage in that critical thinking process to think of what is it that you should be doing. And then, lastly, using the subjects, apparatus or materials, and procedures described by the author. So given what the author just told me, what you just read, what results would I predict for the experiment? The results section is the next one that's coming up. Right? So given the introduction that you read and the methods that you just finished reading, you should be able to say, this is what I predict should occur. And that needs to be done before you read what actually occurred. Because again, you cannot unring that bell and think about, well, what would I have thought before I heard this? That's nearly impossible. So make sure that you predict it beforehand and say that I predict this group should score higher than this group. I predict that there should be no difference between the two of them based on what I've read so far. And then that will help you do two things. Number one, it'll prepare your mind for the results because the results are hard. Results are challenging. But if you're already thinking about this should be higher than this, that one should be lower than that, it helps get your mind ready. And then number two, you're going to be able to very quickly realize what's surprising, what's unusual, what's unexpected. Right? What is, the big sort of story in the results. So that's the method section. So we're done. We try to guess what's going to happen in the results, and then we read the results. So, number 6. Yep.
So then would you be skipping over the abstract when you go to read an article? Because doesn't the abstract sometimes give away the results?
That's a good point. If you want to fully apply this, yes. You actually would. I'll be honest with you, I never do that because I read the abstract to see if I want to read the article,
right.
Because you need to know whether it's exactly that. I guess being told a little bit about what happened wouldn't offset this too much, but you're absolutely right. I mean, if you want to go for the full critical thinking attack, skip the abstract. It's a good point. Skip the title then too, because good titles will oftentimes have at least a part of the results. Right, so a bad title We'll discuss this when we get to title pages later on, but a bad title or an ineffective title would be something like, the effects of social media on depression, right? So you know it's social media, you know it's depression, but it really doesn't tell you anything. A better title would be something like, high social media users have lower depression. Something like that would actually give you the direction. So that's a better title. So, I mean, I guess that gives you some of the results. But yeah, that's a good point. You are critically thinking about the checklist. This checklist should have skip the abstract. That's step number 1. Okay, so back to the checklist at hand. Did the author get unexpected results? Can't answer that unless you've already tried to guess what the results should be. And then, did the author get unexpected results? That you get from the introduction to method and the results. And then 7A, 7B, and 7C is you trying to guess the discussion. So 6 is, do the numbers that they report match up with the numbers that you predicted? 7 is, what do those numbers mean? So how would I interpret the results? So this group is higher than this group. What does that mean? These two groups are the same. What does that mean? Does it support the theories in the introduction? Does it refute the theories? Does it partially support? What do these results mean? You try to interpret the results first. What applications and implications would I draw from my interpretation of the results? So in our group memory experiment, what applications can you use for this? What instances of people working in groups in society would this affect? Juries, board meetings, group therapy, study groups, political rallies, other places where groups come together and try to remember things. What are some of the implications that you would have? Because again, when you read an implication, when you read that other information, it kind of closes off your mind sometimes to those possibilities. And then finally, is there an alternative explanation for the results? Is there some other factor that could have accounted for the results? Is there some other unmeasured or unaccounted for variable that could have caused this? Could the results have changed because of who ran the experiment? So see if there's some sort of alternative explanation, some other interpretation of the results that you can come up with. And then once you figure out how you would interpret the results, how you would do the applications and implications, how you might say, might identify alternative explanations. Basically, when you decide how you would write the discussion section for this paper, then you can go read the discussion section. So does my interpretation or the author's better represent the data? That's a very important question. You, again, be surprised how often the authors or don't interpret the data correctly. So I'm reminded of a conference presentation that was tweeted and and what they showed was they measured the gender equality across a bunch of different countries. And then they measured the gender difference in performance on a spatial task. And this spatial task had been shown that males were better at this spatial task than females. That was a kind of consistent finding. And what they found was that the larger the inequality between males and females in a society, the larger the difference between their ability on this spatial task. So they measured the inequality of males and females in these different countries, and then they measured males and females' ability to do this task in different countries, and they correlated the data. And hopefully everybody knows that correlation does not equal causation, right? Hopefully everybody's heard that. We'll hear it again when we take a look at correlation in this class. But correlation does not imply causation. Everybody that I saw, all the scientists that were in that Twitter thread, were all talking about how the gap in the tests is being caused by the inequality. The inequality, the patriarchy, the unfair treatment of the different genders was causing the gap, but it was correlational. You can't make that conclusion. So their interpretation was dangerous. It was not allowed. You're not allowed to imply or conclude causation from correlation. So you'd be surprised how often that happens when the data fits a certain narrative. Just human beings run with it occasionally, and scientists are human beings. So 8.8 is my interpretation or the authors better represent the data. 8b, do I or the author offer a more cogent discussion of the applications and implications of the results? Sometimes an author will miss what their results really mean. Sometimes they'll miss what, how to apply the stuff that they found. Sometimes they'll miss it just because they published this article in a time before the technology allowed them to make these implications. So you might be reading a study from the 60s, from the 70s, that could have massive implications to our world of social media. Those authors weren't going to give you that implication because it didn't exist back then. So do you have better applications or implications of the results? And then 8c, what questions are left unanswered? This is more an exercise, again, in critical thinking, because there are always questions left unanswered. And if you ever wonder, where does a researcher get their ideas? If you're when you're doing your advanced lab and somebody asks you, what research project do you want to do? And you're sitting there going, I don't know. Where does a researcher come up with their ideas? They come up with their ideas at the end of a discussion. They read the end of the discussion section and say, they missed out. They forgot about this. They didn't answer this question. Maybe I'll do that study and try to answer that question. And that one leads right into this one. What additional studies might I do? You would do the additional studies that answered those unanswered questions. So you can see that these ones link directly back to question 7a, 7b, and 7c. And this is the sort of checklist that you should have when you're reading your research papers. So I would highly recommend print out these 4 slides so that you can have them next to you, or have your textbook open to this checklist so you can have it next to you so you can just kind of follow along. And when you're reading your research papers, this will help you navigate them, because it might seem like more work at the beginning, but if you are thinking about these questions as you read, especially, let's go back to the introduction one real quick. If you're thinking about these questions as you read the introduction, you will more likely process information that will help you answer these questions. So if you've ever read a page of something, some required reading, if you've ever read a page and then at the end of it, you think to yourself, what did I just read? I can't even remember. What was the last sentence? I'm kind of blanking here. It's because you weren't actively engaging with the material. So when you have a goal, when you have questions, when you're sitting there going, what is the author's goal? Let me find this. And what is the hypothesis that they're testing? Let me make sure I'm looking for that. It'll actually help you make sense of this, because, reading articles, they are more challenging than your textbook. They're at a higher sort of level than your textbook information is. So it is going to be a little bit of a challenge when you first start. So I would highly recommend go in there with, what is the author's applications and implications? Are mine better? Where are the unanswered questions? Keep that in mind as you're reading through. It'll help you process that information. All right, so that's the checklist for the critical reader.